Are nonprofit services free? We are going to tackle that question in this video today. If you don't know me, I'm Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help people start nonprofits and raise money from the ground up. So follow this channel if you need help with that. I wanted to tackle this question because people are so confused about nonprofits, and I want to dispel the myths that people have about the nonprofit industry. So what's the answer to the question? Yes, sometimes. And it depends on a lot of things. So I want to share 4 things to help you kind of understand a little bit better about why a nonprofit services would be free and why a nonprofit services would not be free. And I know some of you are asking the question, well, should they be free? And some of you may feel like they should always be free. But hopefully after you watch this video, you'll have a deeper appreciation and deeper understanding, and you may think a little bit more about the answer to that question. So here's number 1, and this may really surprise you, but nonprofits are not funded eternally. For some reason, people think that nonprofits have like an endless source of money. Well, they at least act like they do, right? Because a lot of times I'll hear people say, nonprofits shouldn't be charging for anything, everything should be free. And I'm like, well, where is the money going to come from for them to run? Because one thing you got to understand is that nonprofits are still businesses. And there are some people who will argue me down and say, oh, they are not businesses. They still have to run. You still have to have a business structure. Most nonprofits who are doing public and like charitable work are corporations. They're businesses. They're set up as businesses, and they still have to pay for accounting. They still have to pay for all the things that other businesses would pay for. They have to pay for legal fees and things like that. But a lot of times people think if it's a charitable nonprofit or if it's a charity that they must not have to pay for anything, or like because all of their stuff is free that they shouldn't charge for anything. And that's not true. Like, nonprofits have to think constantly about how to raise money and where their money is coming from. And you may think to yourself, well, there's grants. They can just get grants. Well, grants are very competitive and grants are finicky. And a lot of times a grant funder will be very specific about how you can use the money and about how you cannot. And if an organization needs the money to maybe upgrade their computers because they're antiquated and they got to be able to do better work or serve their clients better, then they may need the money for that. But if a grant funder says, hey, we don't want you using our money for equipment or computers, then they have to figure out where else to get it from. So it's not just a simple answer as, hey, they get money all the time, they shouldn't be charging for anything. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And here's the other thing that I say all the time. There are nonprofit colleges, there are nonprofit hospitals, shoot, there are nonprofit banks. So people often don't have a good conception or good understanding of what nonprofits are, and don't often understand when they're engaging with a nonprofit. See, people's thoughts of nonprofits typically go to like Goodwill or the Red Cross, or maybe like the local shelter or a local organization that helps kids or does mentoring and things like that. We tend to have, especially in the United States, like a very narrow view of what a nonprofit is and what a nonprofit does. But even within the 501c3 charitable status, there are different types of nonprofits and their businesses they have to run. Can you think about what it costs to run a hospital? They absolutely need money, because honestly, I don't want to go to a hospital that has outdated equipment. I don't want to go to a hospital that's not attracting high quality staff, right? And you need money to do that. You need money to attract those people. So they have to be able to charge in order to be able to make some money. Here's the second thing you need to know about that may surprise you, which is very related to what I just talked about, is that a lot of nonprofits are not just volunteer run. There are a lot of people that I encounter who think that nonprofits are only run by volunteers or don't have paid staff, which is so interesting to me because we engage with nonprofits all the time. You may not realize it's a nonprofit, but you probably have engaged with a nonprofit, if not today, sometime this week. And a lot of times you're engaging with a staff member of the nonprofit. There's probably somebody in your family who works for a nonprofit. But it's really weird when I hear people say, well, nonprofits shouldn't have staff. They just need to be charities. And I'm like, well, how else would the work get done? Because the reality is this. There are things that the government should do, but can't do. They don't have the capacity to do. They're not good at, or they're just not doing for the citizens. And then there are things that businesses could do, for-profits could do, that they're not doing. And there's a really big hole for that. There's a really, really big hole for that, and nonprofits fill that hole a lot of times. They provide services that nobody else will provide, or people can't afford, or couldn't otherwise access. And here's a trend you need to think about. A lot of times when there's administrations like in the federal government that do not favor government, and in 2025, there's about to be a changeover in the federal administration, and they absolutely do not care for government. And they're talking a lot about shrinking, especially the federal workforce, which may or may not have an impact on the state and local governments. But they're talking about shrinking the workforce. So if that work can't be done, who's going to pick up the slack? Well, a lot of times the reason why they don't favor government is because they want to push that to the market, because they want for-profit businesses to take it up. And a lot of times if it's work that a for-profit wouldn't do, then nonprofits take on that work, especially in the social services realm. So you got to remember, nonprofits do really important work, really vital work, very technical work. And so if we have this attitude that everything should be free or they should not charge or anything, then it will be really hard for them to survive. But there's a caveat to all of this, which takes me to my next point. So the other thing you got to think about is that not all nonprofits are charitable. So under the 501c3 revenue code, there are different definitions for organizations that meet that status. So they're able to have 501c3 status. And it's not all charitable. Charitable is one of them, but it could be for scientific reasons. It could be for educational reasons. It could be religious reasons why you want to be a tax exempt nonprofit and get 501c3 status. It's not all charitable. So if an organization isn't charitable, they aren't necessarily required to do things for free, because that's not the basis of their work. Sometimes there are services a nonprofit provides that should be free, right? But that's for them to decide. I'm just saying it can't be an expectation that it's always free, because a lot of them aren't necessarily set up to be charitable. But here's one thing I do want to say. If an organization has 501c3 status because they fit that charitable category, then they should be providing things in a charitable way, meaning that you're not going to charge for a service that a for-profit business would charge. Because if you're doing that, then in the IRS's opinion, why are you a nonprofit if you're doing the same thing a for-profit is doing? You don't get this privilege, right? So if you are fitting under the charitable kind of category, then you need to make sure that your services are discounted, or there's some kind of sliding scale that people who normally couldn't access this or couldn't afford it are able to afford it because of the work that you're doing. So a nonprofit needs to be mindful that if they're fitting under the charitable category, that they are severely discounting their services or providing a sliding scale, and they're providing it to people who otherwise couldn't access it, otherwise couldn't afford the service, right? So there's still an obligation to be charitable. There's still an obligation for those who fit in that category. So I'm not saying that nonprofits should always charge for things. I'm not saying that at all. Please don't get that confused. I'm just saying that if you do charge, you still have an expectation not to charge at market rate or charge what a for-profit business would normally charge. Here's the last thing I'll say, and maybe this will help you answer the question about, do you think nonprofit services should be free? Is that nonprofits are allowed to make a profit. And in my opinion, they should. So I see a lot of chatter about this as well, where people say, well, nonprofits shouldn't be making a profit. It's literally in the name, non-profit. And people think they are so clever when they say this, because they're like, yeah, it makes sense, non-profit. But what that really means is that the purpose or the driving factor behind decisions made for the organization is not profit. But that doesn't mean they're not allowed to make profit. And honestly, experts are going to tell you, as a nonprofit, you should be making profit, meaning you need to make more money than what you spend in a year so that you can keep money for savings or reserves in case something happens. Case in point, the COVID-19 pandemic. Nonprofits who did not have any savings, who did not have any reserves, were really struggling because they couldn't maintain. They didn't have anything to tap into, whereas others with reserves could operate at some level until the government was able to step in and really support all businesses really during that time. But it makes a lot of sense. Just think about if you're a business. for you to have reserves on hand. They tell us in our personal lives to have 3 to 6 months of savings on hand. It just makes a lot of sense for you to be able to have access to some cash, to be able to make certain moves, to be able to grow as an organization. I think it's a really good thing when the nonprofit has the room and the flexibility to make better decisions on behalf of its staff, to support its staff to do good work. Because that's part of the conversation that people don't mention, is that you don't understand the impact on staff when you do that. Because usually a nonprofit that's scrimping and scrounging around for money probably isn't paying their staff very well and don't have a lot of benefits or incentives for people to be there. And when people are unhappy on the job, they don't provide good service. And so think about the people who need the work the most that these nonprofits serve. They're not getting quality people to do the work because they're not being treated well, because we believe somehow that nonprofits should not make money and have enough room to make better decisions to support its staff. So I wanted to pull the curtain back a little bit around this conversation, because people like to talk up here and they like to talk globally and make these big statements like, well, nonprofits shouldn't make profit. What's the point? That's not why you got into this. But I hope we really understand there are different types of nonprofits, and that nonprofits are still businesses. They still need money to run. And of course, I'm not saying they should be gluttonous or greedy or extort people or exploit. No, I wouldn't want a for-profit business to do that, honestly. I don't like when for-profit businesses are gluttonous, but we don't talk about that. We don't shame them for that. That's for another video. But all I'm saying is it's okay for a nonprofit to charge for services and make money. And it's okay if they don't charge for services, but they need to make sure they have the financial resources so they can keep running. So what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Now that you've listened to the whole video, did your answer change? What are your thoughts? I know people have really strong opinions about that, so I'm curious about what people are going to say. If you need help with your nonprofit, make sure you visit me at bossonabudget.com. I have resources for people who are thinking about starting a nonprofit or who need help raising money from the ground up. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.